my mind the trial and the highlights of the trial and the stresses of the trial as if it was yesterday. And I still miss Mitch and John and the whole team and Maseth. And, you know, we really had a once in a lifetime experience. And the fact that it's 2 decades ago is pretty bracing.
I know that Frank Jr. wrote the letter from prison in 1998. When did you become involved in this case?
So I was overseas. I was in Kosovo, the section chief for the Department of Justice, and I got a call when I came back to the U.S. in 2006. I told the U.S. Attorney's Office that I was returning, and they asked me if I wanted to participate in this case called Family Secrets. And frankly, I had not been as up to speed on what was going on in Chicago, and I called an old friend of mine and asked about this case, and she said, well, you've got this is the case of a lifetime. This is a great opportunity. You get to work with Mitch Mars and John Scully and a great team. And so I looked up the case, did a little bit of research, and was just floored by what a wonderful opportunity it was to work with those guys, people I've always wanted to work with. And so I immediately called back and said, yep, absolutely. I'd love to work on with those guys and be sort of the new addition. And so that was in 2006 when I first got involved in Family Secrets.
What can you tell us about that team that was put together? Not just the prosecutors, but also the FBI agents that spent years developing and prosecuting this case. Tell me about that team. How committed were they?
It was by far the most committed team I've ever had the opportunity and the privilege of working with. I mean, one of the things is that you find in some cases is in some ways we as prosecutors, agents are fungible. I mean, you could kind of swap us out, but over time with this team, and again, I was the new addition to the team in 2006. Over time, you really see how everyone had their own role. Everyone had a particular piece of the puzzle, of the mosaic that was being put together. For me, just getting up to speed on a case that had really been percolating for decades was a major challenge. But then I really appreciated how every member of the team, all the agents, all the prosecutors had a very specific, important role and something to add to the team, which made it a particularly amazing experience.
I talked to Frank Jr. earlier today, as I mentioned, about why he sat down and wrote that letter. But from from your side of the ledger here as a prosecutor, tell me about the importance of that decision he made, and would there have been a case without it?
There could have been a case without Frank Jr., but it wouldn't have been the case that we had. I mean, ultimately, Frank Jr. and, of course, Nick Calabrese both agreeing to cooperate at different times, not knowing that the other was cooperating. That's where the name Family Secrets comes from. It's sort of a double entendre, but was crucially important. I mean, his ability to make audio tapes that backed up the testimony that we got from Nick was the key to the case and really made it the strong case that it was. And again, along with all of the incredible work that the agents did over many years to put together really a blockbuster case.
The trial lasted 6 to 8 weeks. I covered all of it. And I remember thinking at the time, and I mentioned this to Frank, I mean, I've seen some great drama, some great plays in Chicago, Steppenwolf, and all the theaters. I've never seen drama like I saw in that federal Dirksen Federal Courthouse room. What was it like being part of that trial?
I mean, honestly, part of it was, like you say, drama was a roller coaster. I mean, every day things expected and unexpected happened. Also, I mean, very candidly, from my perspective, my big objective was don't screw up. Mitch Mars, when I delivered the closing, in more colorful terms than that, suggested that I shouldn't screw up. Obviously, just to sort of lighten the mood a little bit. But when you're the new member of a team, and everyone has put in so much effort, I mean, thousands of hours. Your objective is not to get an A+. Your objective is just to do your job and do it well enough that you don't screw up. And that was my objective throughout the trial. I like to think I met that objective. But it was drama filled. I mean, every day, and we were always aware that the public was there in large part to see the mobsters, right? To see kind of to see them and hear what they had to say. But over the course of the trial, I think they also came to appreciate that we as prosecutors and the agents had a lot to do with this case, and really some of the most dramatic moments are the result of great cross-examinations by my colleagues, as much as it was just the inherent nature of sitting there and watching what some viewed as the last of a dying breed. I view the mob as still very much active, but it was, again, it was an incredibly dramatic series of months for us. And of
Yeah.
course, the time leading up to that was equally tumultuous.
Talk to me a little bit about your colleague Mitch Mars, who unfortunately so sadly passed away not long after the trial ended. How central was he? I mean, he really was the mob guy at the U.S. Attorney's Office, right?
Yeah, look, Mitch was the beating heart of the case. Mitch and John together, they were the beating heart of this blockbuster, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to take down the most significant mob case, at least the FBI describes it that way, in the nation's history, in terms of decades and in terms of number of defendants, and particularly when you look at it against the backdrop of Chicago's history with the mob. Mitch was an unbelievably kind person, unbelievably thoughtful person, unbelievably talented person. Some people didn't realize how fierce he could be until he decided it was time for them to realize it. I, as a at the beginning of my legal career, in a sense, was downstairs on the third floor, and those guys up and doing the mob cases were always mysterious to us because we didn't really have an opportunity to work with them. We always wondered what they're up to. And when I got to sort of get into the sanctum sanctorum and began working with those guys, I really appreciated what they did, and it's amazing. And Mitch, again, was so central to everything we did, and was as important as any person could be to that prosecution.
Did you know at the time that Frank Calabrese Sr. had threatened your life during the trial?
No, I mean, in a way, I understand that if you're a defendant and you've got to hear me going on for 5 hours in closing, that you might develop some negative feelings. Ultimately, what caused the issue with Frank Sr. was that I caught him chuckling and about while I was in the middle of talking about one of the murders he committed, and I confronted him on it because he testified. That gave me some latitude. I confronted him on it, and he muttered, "You're an effing," although he didn't use that term, "dead man." I didn't hear it. None of the agents heard it. None of my colleagues heard it. But the jury, and the jury looks at a trial much like a tennis match, right? They kind of watch who's hitting the ball. And so when I'm speaking, they look at me, and then they look at Frank to see a response, and they saw that response and saw him muttering the things he muttered. We ultimately had testimony, hearing on whether or not Frank actually said those things, and Judge Zagel, found he did. But no, I did not hear it. I was not aware of it until weeks after the trial.
You mentioned a short time ago about how the FBI has characterized this trial. Um, why is it the most important mob prosecution in U.S. history? What's the legacy of this trial?
I think the legacy of the trial is in part that it was the first time in Chicago we've ever had a made member of the mob convicted of a murder. And in fact, we had many murders and number of made members being charged and convicted here. It spanned many decades. I mean, we had testimony going back to the 50s and even 40s, the beginning of the mob. So the conspiracy that was alleged went back many decades. We had, many defendants. We had really an amazing array of crimes that this organization committed. And so when the FBI says it's the most expansive mob murder case in U.S. history, all of those factors play into that assessment. The amount of time involved, the amount of crimes involved, the decades of criminal conspiracy are all central to that assessment.
To what degree did it cripple the abilities of the Chicago outfit to continue functioning?
It's always that's a question that comes up quite a lot, Dane, and it's a difficult one to answer. And the reason it's difficult to answer is, unlike on the East Coast, where the mob was run along patriarchal lines, right? The family name, and you kind of knew if you're Bonanno that there was a good chance that depending on where you were in the family hierarchy, what you might be doing. Chicago was always much more organized like a Fortune 200 company with a CEO and then people who worked their way up. And then most of the times the people who worked their way up, then their children did not get involved in the mob, very much unlike the East Coast. And so figuring out both who's in charge and what they're doing today has always been a challenge, because we never knew whether there were false flags. In other words, whether people were kind of pushed forward as the bosses of the mob that actually were not the bosses. And so it's hard to say today where the mob's at. It's hard to say how much the trial did to cripple the mob. I will say that we were told, and I can't get into too many details, but there's certainly evidence that the mob is not even close to full strength anymore in the way that they once were, but they also are not dead. In other words, the story of the mob's demise is premature, and they're still very much active. And one of the things about the mob that's really extraordinary is, unlike street gangs that have a lot of power on the streets and commit murder and mayhem wherever they are, the mob has influence on politicians, has influence on law enforcement and the judiciary. And in Chicago, certainly that was always true. And I dare say that at least some of that, no doubt, is still true today.
I talked to Frank about Uncle Nick. He told me, and I don't know how much of this is out there, but apparently he was released from prison at some point, lived with his family, lived with his kids, and died of natural causes a couple years ago. Um, how how difficult was it to offer a deal to a guy that had committed so many murders? And what do you think now when you look back on the fact that he died a free man?
Yeah, I will say, I'll answer your question sort of with a bit more nuance than normal. When I first got in the case, I had a very clear idea of what should happen to Nick Calabrese from a moral perspective. And as I got to know kind of the circumstances of his cooperation, obviously also got to know him, my view on that changed a bit. And so with Nick, most defense attorneys bring their clients in, they work out elaborate deals, they try to get the absolute best thing they can for their client, and then their client agrees to cooperate. In Nick's case, he came in and he said, "I want you to treat me fairly." And that's the only condition he set, and it wasn't in writing. He just said to the prosecutors, and this is before my time on the case, "I want you to treat me fairly." And so ultimately, our obligation was to let the court know about how important his testimony was. And so Judge Zagel took that all into account and gave him what many, including many of the victims who were very much on our side and very much supportive of the prosecution. We saw them almost every day before court. The victims were very upset with the sentence that Nick got, and the fact that he died a free man. People are going to have different views on that, but I will say that the Nick Calabrese I met was difficult. And I said this at his sentencing. The Nick Calabrese that I met was difficult, maybe impossible to reconcile with the Nick Calabrese that committed the crimes that he was charged with and was held responsible for. He lived up to every part of his deal. He testified to dozens of criminal acts and murders that the government had no idea about, frankly, before he began talking. And so he did what we expected and more, and we held up our side of the deal. And that's the way the system works. Again, different people will view these things differently, but that's what we did, and we held up. We were true to our word, and he was true to his. And Judge Zagel did what Judge Zagel thought was right.
I think we're good. Do you stay in touch with anybody from the trial?
I try to stay in touch with Mike Maseth, but it's so difficult with schedules and so forth, and me not living in Chicago anymore to kind of really to see each other as much as I'd like. I stay in touch with Amr Bachu, who sort of participated in the tail end of the mob work that we did, and so. But Amr, of course, famously tight-lipped. He never gives me any inside scoop. Even the day I left the office, I think. Was the last day I got any sort of inside knowledge about the mob, except from other sources once in a while. But so unfortunately, not as much as I'd like to. But we still get together. The people on the strike force. There's an annual holiday party that I try to make when I can, that everyone goes to. So it's a lot of the people who actually were in the office well before me, who we get together and have a chance to sort of reminisce. And we often talk about, you know, obviously Mitch and those good old days.
Is there, you might know, is there even an organized crime unit within the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago anymore, or has it been folded into something else?
My understanding is that there still is one. Obviously, with Amar's departure, that will make a significant difference. Again, I'm not as attuned to what's going on there, except to say that, you know, obviously Andrew Boutros is honestly one of the nicest people and one of the best attorneys I've ever met in my life. And I'm sure he will take, if there's an interest to be taken, he'll take an interest in it. I know the FBI has deprioritized some of this what's called traditional OC or traditional organized crime work. But again, we'll have to see what happens and what the future brings when it comes to that.